Dear listeners, today we continue with the leaders of Egypt. For our enchanting bedtime stories, today we have the story of Tutankhamun. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your likes and comments. Let's begin. In a time when the sun painted the Nile like a golden ribbon, a young pharaoh sat upon the throne of Egypt around 1400 BC. They called him Tutankhamun, which means the living image of Amun. However, the story of this young king begins with a mystery as deep as the deserts. It is unknown when or in which palace he first drew breath. The pages of history are silent on this matter. The identity of his father remains an enigma, still debated in whispers among Egyptologists. One of the clues we possess is an ancient beetle amulet, Scribe, found in the sacred temple of Osiris at Abydos. This amulet whispers the name of his mother, Merit-Ra. Another clue is a red granite lion statue quietly sitting in the cool halls of the British Museum. The hieroglyphs inscribed upon it state, quote, Tutankhamun restored the monuments of his father, Nebmahatra, that is, Amenhotep III, the king of the south and north, lord of the two lands, descendant of Ra. End quote. These words suggest that Tutankhamun might have been the son of the mighty Amenhotep III by one of his secondary wives. If so, he used the word father in its literal sense. However, there is no conclusive proof of this. It is also possible that the young king used the word father to simply mean his predecessor on the throne, a common expression of respect used by pharaohs. Old Egyptologists were inclined to accept the inscription on the lion dedicated at the Temple of Sulb in Nubia as factual. Yet modern historians regard this connection with skepticism. Regardless of the truth, the name of Tutankhamun's father has been lost beneath the sands of time. So how did this mysterious prince ascend to the very pinnacle of Egypt, the throne? They say he derived his authority from his marriage to Princess Ankhesenpaten, the third daughter of the heretic king Akhenaten. This marriage opened the doors to pharaonic power for him. At least that is the most widespread rumor. But there is another whisper. Perhaps Tutankhamun seized power by disposing of Samenkhkara, or Siakhara, who had usurped the throne before him. This Samenkhkara had taken the throne by marrying Princess Meritaten, or Atenmeret, Akhenaten's eldest daughter. How Tutankhamun maneuvered through this complex court intrigue remains another secret. In the early days of his reign, Tutankhamun adhered to the revolutionary religion initiated by his father-in-law, the Aten, or sun disk cult. His name was not yet Tutankhamun, but Tutankhaten. He publicly declared his acceptance of the religious views of his wife and the heretic king. The most tangible proof of this is a fragment of a limestone stela preserved today in Berlin. Inscribed on this stone is the young king's name, Lord of the Two Lands, Rakheperaneb, Lord of Crowns, Tutankhaten, given life forever.
he did not immediately sever ties with the Aten cult. He even began work on a temple or monument for Aten in the holy city of Thebes. We discovered traces of this construction through a cunning method. Horemheb, who succeeded him and tried to erase his legacy, used countless stone blocks bearing Tutankhamun's name in his own buildings. It is impossible to know the full extent of Tutankhamun's construction activities because the same Horemheb appropriated most of the young king's works as his own. Wherever possible, Horemheb had Tutankhamun's name chiseled out and replaced with his own. This appropriation went so far as to include the famous Tutankhamun obelisk, discovered by Lagrange at Karnak in 1905. One of the most pivotal moments in history was when he abandoned the name Tutankhaten and took the name Tutankhamen, meaning the living image of Amen. This marked the end of the Aten Revolution and the beginning of the return to the ancient gods. The most important source regarding the young king's actions is the famous obelisk found in Cairo. Although the destructive hand of time has unfortunately damaged parts of the text, the remaining lines vividly describe the state of turmoil in Egypt when Tutankhamun ascended the throne. Although the hieroglyphs dating the obelisk are broken, the first lines list the king's glorious titles. He is the beloved of Amen-Ra, the great god of Thebes, of the gods Temu and Ra-Herahuti of Anu, Heliopolis, of Ptah of Memphis, and of Thoth, lord of the divine words, i.e., sacred writings and hieroglyphs. The text also reveals the king's self-perception. He is the good son of Amen, begotten of Kamuteth, born of a glorious seed, a sacred egg, and brought forth by the god Amen himself. Amen built his body, shaped him, and perfected his form. The divine spirits of Anu were with him from his youth, for it was decreed that he should be an eternal king, a settled Horus, who would dedicate all his energy and attention to the service of his ancestral gods.
These statements go far beyond ordinary praise. If we read them as the king intended, they show that his ascension to the Egyptian throne was sanctioned by the ancient priests of Heliopolis, Memphis, Hermopolis, and Thebes, registering his legitimacy in the divine court. The sympathy that Akhenaten IV, Amenhotep, harbored for the heretical Aten cult seems to have entirely vanished by the time Tutankhamun erected this great obelisk at Karnak. It is clear that the young Tutankhamun did everything in his power to meet the expectations of Egypt's ancient and powerful priesthood. The text describes the chaos gripping the nation, quote, "The king revived the monuments which had existed for centuries but were ruined during the reign of Akhenaten. He put an end to rebellion and dissatisfaction. Truth was re-established firmly in the two lands, where Akhenaten had ruled." The text continues, quote, "When His Majesty became king of the south, The entire country was in a state of chaos, similar to the primal times, i.e., at creation. The possessions of the temples of the gods and goddesses from Abu, Elephantine, to the marshes of the delta were destroyed. Their shrines were ruins, and their estates had become desert. Weeds grew in the sacred courtyards of the temples. The sanctuaries were demolished, and the sacred areas had become common thoroughfares for people. The lands were laid waste. The gods had turned their backs on the country, and the people were afflicted as if with a deadly disease. This general state of ruin was, of course, due to the great god's treasuries no longer being filled with massive revenues or tribute from the vassal tribes in Palestine and Syria. It was inevitable that temple buildings would fall into disrepair and fertile fields would lie uncultivated when the power of central authority was broken. Tutankhamun's text hits hard with the painful truth even when an envoy was sent to Syria to extend Egypt's borders during that period. The mission failed. The tribute collectors returned empty-handed because the tribes refused to pay. There was no benefit in praying to any god or goddess, for no answers were given to the pleas of the supplicants. The hearts of the gods were disgusted with humankind, and they had seemingly decided to destroy their own creations.
However, the text heralds hope. The days when such things happened passed away, and at length His Majesty ascended the throne of his father and began to set things in order and rule it. The lands of Horus, the temple cities and their possessions, Egypt and the Red Land, the desert, came under his supervision, and every country bowed in salutation, submitting to his will. The young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, did not immediately return to Thebes, where the heart of Egypt beat upon ascending the throne. The ancient texts whisper that he lived in the great house at Per-Ahikheperkara. This palace was likely located far from the memories of the heretic king's wicked city, in the north, in a suburb of the old capital Memphis, or very near it. Perhaps he was unsure of the reception awaiting him in Thebes. After all, the Amen priesthood had not forgotten the betrayal of his father or father-in-law. Thus, Tutankhamun settled in the safe haven of the north, ruling like Ra in the sky. There, he dedicated his mind to redrawing the plan of this land. He debated earnestly in his own heart how to proceed to win the hearts of the people and appease the wrath of the gods. After casting aside Aten and all the gilded promises of the sun disk, his first task was to seek the welfare of his father Amen. He did something unprecedented to rebuild the shattered trust. He vowed to elevate Amen's power and glory to a level Egypt had never before witnessed. The text relates that he had a magnificent statue of Amen's august manifestation made of pure gold, or electrum, a gold-silver alloy. We lack a clear description of this masterpiece, but from the brilliance of the art of that era, we can imagine how glorious this figure, cast in solid gold and reflecting the god's divine might, must have been.
Perhaps it was like the gold-plated silver god figures we see today in museum halls, which must have once come from a sacred temple.
Tutankhamun's generosity did not stop there. For Father Amen, he had another figure made, mounted on 13 staffs, adorned with pure chum metal, gold or electrum, lapis lazuli, and all kinds of precious stones. This is significant because it is said that the old figure of Amen rested on only 11 staffs. This was a symbolic testament to how greatly the god's prestige had been elevated. He honored not only Amen, but all the gods. To the south of his wall, he had a figure made of Ptah, the lord of Memphis, the owner of life. This statue was similarly adorned with gold, electrum, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and priceless stones. The rumor is that the old Ptah figure in the Memphis temple had only 6 staffs, while the one the king commissioned was far more magnificent. The young king began constructing monuments to all the gods throughout Egypt. He had their sacred statues remade from the finest and purest chum metal available. He rebuilt the ruined temples. This time, he personally ensured that their foundations were laid solidly, and the craftsmanship was durable. Most importantly, he reinstated the divine offerings to the gods. He made all necessary arrangements to ensure these offerings would not be interrupted. His endowments were so generous that he guaranteed daily offerings to all temples, and these offerings were more abundant and richer than previously imaginable. He appointed new officials to serve in the temples. He selected libation bearers and servants from the sons of well-reputed leading families of the villages and towns. To cover the increased wages of these new officials, he donated immense quantities of gold, silver, bronze, and other valuable metals to the temples.
He restocked the temples. He filled them with male and female servants and gifts that were part of the spoils he had captured. This suggests he was not only a peaceful restorer, but also a warrior king who reasserted Egypt's power. In addition to the gifts he gave to the priests and servants, he also increased the revenues of the temples. The revenues of some temples doubled, some tripled, and some even quadrupled. Treasuries were flooded with cham metal, gold, lapis lazuli, turquoise, all kinds of precious stones, the finest royal linen, byssus, oils, unguents, perfumes, the rarest incense and myrrh. The king made generous donations of every beautiful thing. After thus enriching the temples and making the necessary arrangements for the daily offerings and services performed for the benefit of the king's spirit, Tutankhamun also set about organizing the festive processions held on the river and in the sacred lakes of the temples. He gathered the most skilled boat builders.
he commanded them to construct new boats from the highest quality fresh acacia wood available in the land of Nagao. Many parts of these sacred boats were covered in pure gold, and as they glided over the Nile, their brilliance illuminated the entire river. This generosity, described in the last 2 paragraphs, reveals the depth of the devastation inflicted by Akhenaten's heresy upon Egypt's ancient religious institutions. The heretic king's followers, Atenists, had destroyed temple walls, dismissed the priesthoods, and confiscated all temple property, using it to propagate their own sun disk cult. The great god figures made of gold and other valuable metals in the temples had been melted down. Consequently, in those difficult times of need, people could not consult their gods, for even if the gods wished to descend to earth to be seen by their devotees, they had no statues in which to embody themselves. There were no priests left in the country, no gods to pray to. Funeral rites could not be performed, and the dead had to be hastily buried in their tombs without the sacred blessings of the priests.
During this period of religious chaos that engulfed the country, what had the Aten king done? He had employed a retinue of male and female slaves, singers, shemayular, and men of the acrobatic class to assist him in his religious services and in the festivals celebrated in Aten's honor. It was these very people whom Tutankhamun purified and transferred to the royal palace. There they carried out a form of servitude related to the service of the father gods, the ancient deities. The king's treatment was seen by them as an act of great grace, and they were exceedingly pleased with their new positions. The final lines of the obelisk proclaim the triumph of this restoration. The gods and goddesses of Egypt once again rejoice that their services are being performed. The ancient order of worship has been reestablished, and all the people of Egypt heartily thank the king who restored this order. In return, the gods have given the king life and tranquility, and with the help of Ra, Ptah, and Thoth, he has ruled his country with wisdom and delivered true judgments to all people every day. Tutankhamun's famous obelisk whispers the answer to this question. It is inscribed there that the priceless gifts the king gave to the priests and temples were part of the spoils His Majesty obtained from the conquered peoples. This single sentence tells us a great deal. The young king's short reign of 8 to 10 years was not spent solely on restoration. He also organized raids to remind the lands his ancestors had conquered and made dependent on Egypt of the power of the Egyptian crown. These might not have been full-scale wars, but they were strong campaigns that proved Egypt was still mighty.
The fact that these words were not empty boast is proven almost visually by a tomb in the quiet hills of western Thebes. This tomb belongs to a powerful man named Hui. Hui was no ordinary man. He was the king's eye, the prince of Kesh, or Nubia. He had served in Nubia during the reign of IV Amenhotep, or Akhenaten, and as a reward for his loyalty, he had been granted full administrative authority over the vast territories stretching from Niken, or El Kab, south of Thebes, to Nest Tawi, or Napata, at the foot of the Fourth Cataract. The scenes carved into the walls of this tomb
silent witnesses to history almost come to life. We see Hui's return from the sun-kissed lands of Nubia to Thebes during Tutankhamun's reign. And he did not come empty-handed. Rivers of gold, so to speak, in the form of dust, in rings, as magnificently crafted vessels of gold and silver, bags filled to the brim with precious stones, beds of Sudanese ebony and ivory, state chairs made of cedar wood, ornate shields, and even a war chariot. But the gifts were not only inanimate treasures. To solidify Egypt's dominance, Hui brought with him the sons of all the prominent tribal chiefs on both banks of the river, from the Sheikh of Ma'am and the Sheikh of Uwait to those from Buhen or Wadi Halfa and Elephantine, and of course a considerable number of slaves as well. Hui and his entourage sailed up the Nile with 6 full boats laden with these treasures. When all these precious goods were unloaded, they were handed over to Tutankhamun's high-ranking officials who had come to meet him. So what was the meaning of this glorious presentation? Egyptologists largely agree that these scenes reflect a historical reality and that Tutankhamun genuinely ruled over Nubia. This was an official tribute demonstrating Egypt's continued control over the gold mines in the south.
Yet there is another whisper. Hui was appointed by the heretic king Akhenaten. He was most likely tied to the Aten cult. In this case, these extraordinary gifts to Tutankhamun may have been a personal offering. Perhaps Hui sought to appease this new powerful pharaoh who had restored the cult of the old god Amen, to pledge his loyalty and to secure his position. Whatever the reason, this gold, silver, and these precious stones from Nubia were highly acceptable to the young king, for they provided him with the wealth necessary for the revival of the priests and temples, the vital means to repair the soul of Egypt. But the scenes in Hui's tomb do not end there. On the walls is another depiction, the chiefs and nobles of Upper Retenu, Syria, presenting gifts to Tutankhamun, just like the Nubians. However, historians find it difficult to accept this scene as equally factual. Why? Because Tutankhamun himself, in his own great inscription obelisk, explicitly admitted that the envoys sent to Syria during the Akhenaten period to enlarge the borders of Egypt were useless and achieved nothing. Nevertheless, the text does not say that he himself did not organize raids into Phoenicia and Syria. Perhaps he did.
Or perhaps something entirely different occurred. Perhaps the chiefs of those small kingdoms in Syria had heard that a new king had ascended the Egyptian throne. But this was not a heretic king cloistered in his palace, but a king following in the footsteps of the great conqueror Thothmes III, a king who honored the god Amen. Perhaps these Syrian princes voluntarily sent these gifts to regain the mighty support of the Egyptian army against their own neighbors and enemies. As glorious as Tutankhamun's efforts to restore the ancient gods of Egypt to their thrones were, his own destiny was equally dark. His story ends abruptly, like a sheet of papyrus severed in the middle of the Nile. It is not known exactly when or how he died. Historians cannot even say for certain how old he was when he passed away. No tomb belonging to him was found in the mountains of Tal al-Amarna, the cursed city of his father-in-law, which was expected since he had abandoned the city. But the strange thing was that for a long time there was no proof of a tomb specifically carved out for him in the sacred valley of the kings, where the mighty pharaohs of Egypt lay in eternal sleep. It was as if the young king was intended to be erased from both this world and the next. For years, explorers crisscrossed this scorching valley. One of those explorers, Mr. Theodore Davis, found a tomb during his excavations in the valley which he believed belonged to Tutankhamun.
What was inside? A broken wooden box, and inside the box, a few pieces of gold foil, once gleaming but now faded, printed with the names of Tutankhamun and his wife, Ankhesenamen. A little distance from this tomb, in a pit, Davis came across mysterious remains, wreaths of dried leaves and flowers, looking like remnants from a hurried funeral ceremony. The lid of a very large broken jar was wrapped in old cloth inscribed with Tutankhamun's name. One of the most beautiful objects Davis found was a small sky blue glazed funeral vase, almost sheltering under a large rock. The hieroglyphs on it were still legible. The beautiful god, Neb-Keperu-Ra, given life. These scattered clues convinced Davis that he had definitively found Tutankhamun's tomb. The traces bearing his name are surprisingly few, even today in museums around the world. Even in the magnificent halls of the British Museum, there are very few pieces belonging to him. The largest and most important is the red granite lion mentioned at the beginning of our story. The lion dedicated at the Sulb Temple in Sudan, proclaiming that he restored the monuments of his father Amenhotep III. What else remained? A small bead with his name inscribed. A small piece of a boomerang model made of blue glazed faience. And perhaps the most personal, the most human of all this grandeur, 2 slender porcelain tubes used for eye paint or kohl. One is dark bluish green, inscribed with the beautiful god, Lord of the Two Lands, Neb-Keperu-Ra, given life forever. The other, which is white, bears the names of both the king and his beloved wife side by side. When a writing pallet bearing the king's name, found at Kurna during the French expedition, is added to these fragments, all these scattered objects suggest one painful truth. The royal tomb had been ruthlessly plundered in a dark moment of history, perhaps as early as the beginning of the 19th century. The heartbreaking letter from Anatolia. However, the most striking, most heartbreaking evidence of the chaos left in the wake of Tutankhamun's sudden death comes not from the sands of Egypt, but from thousands of miles away, from the heart of Anatolia, from the clay tablets found in the Hittite capital, Bogaskoi, Hattusa. These tablets were written in cuneiform and were in the Hittite language. one of them recorded a desperate, almost unbelievable plea from the Egyptian palace. The young queen was so helpless after her husband's death that, rather than marry a commoner and violate Egypt's 1,000-year-old tradition, she contemplated bringing a prince from a rival empire to be pharaoh in Egypt. This letter is a living testament to the crisis that brought Egypt to the brink following the young king's death. Certainly, we embark towards the heart of the Great Revolution, the deepest, most complex section of our story, which shook Egypt to its very roots. Even if we scour all the religious texts, papyri, and temple walls covered in the sands of ancient Egypt, we cannot find a single coherent, logical explanation detailing exactly what the Egyptians believed about the god they called Aten. We can only speculate as to why this cult suddenly began to blaze towards the end of the 18th dynasty. We find its fundamental doctrines echoing in the hymns carved into the walls of the heretic kings' tombs in Tal al-Amarna. However, the true history of this religion's birth, rise, and subsequent collapse after it rocked Egypt may never be fully known. The word Aten, or Aten, is actually a very ancient word. It means the disk of the sun, or the face of the sun, and Atenism was undoubtedly the revitalization of one of the oldest forms of sun worship. But in the lands of Egypt, the sun was sacred long before Aten came to be accepted as a specific form of that great sun deity.
One of the oldest of these gods was Her, or Horus, who was believed in the most ancient times to represent the face or height of the sky during the day. His symbol was the falcon soaring through the heavens. The right eye of that falcon represented the sun, and the left eye represented the moon. In later ages, they called him Her-Ur, or Old Horus. He was the bright god of day who battled and defeated Set, the god of night darkness and the night sky, every single day. The oldest and most glorious center of the sun god cult was the famous city of Anu, known in the Bible as On, and called Heliopolis, or Sun City, by the Greeks. Here, since the beginning of time, stood a massive temple dedicated to the sun god, and attached to this temple was a college of priests, renowned throughout Egypt for their wisdom and celestial knowledge. These priests named their god Tem, or Atem. In later times, they depicted him in the form of a magnificent man, wearing the combined crowns of South and North Egypt, holding the Ankh, or life, in his right hand, and a scepter in his left. He was the king of both heaven and Egypt. Tem was a sun god, and, like all the other ancient gods in Egypt, he gradually assimilated the power and attributes of many local gods, whose names were even forgotten by time. The pyramid texts
which guided the soul on its journey to the land of the dead, describe his absolute power in the heavens. His priests had proclaimed him the greatest of all gods. Various versions of the Book of the Dead repeatedly emphasize Tem's supremacy. All other sun gods came to be accepted over time as merely different forms, different faces of him. The words poured from the mouth of the soul in chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead tell us who he is. I am Tem in my rising. I was the one who existed in Nenu, the primal water mass. I am Ra when he first rises. I am the great God who created himself from Nenu and made his own names the assembly of the gods. I am irresistible among the gods. I am Tem, who sits upon his disk, or Aten. I am yesterday. I know today. I am the Bennu, that is, the phoenix, found in Anu, or Heliopolis, and I keep the record of all things created, and those not yet existing.
This first assembly of gods, Ennead, presided over by Father Tem, consisted of Shu, air and heat, and Tefnut, moisture, Geb, earth, and Nut, sky, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys. According to one legend, Tem created Shu and Tefnut from his own body, and these three gods formed the first holy triad, the Trinity. Tem himself said, I became three from one God. From these ancient texts, we understand that Tem existed originally in Nenu, the great primal water mass. When he existed, he was the one who existed. He created himself as the great God. He had many names, and merely by uttering them, transformed them into the other gods who formed his assembly of deities. He was the supreme Lord of the gods. He knew the past and the future. And most importantly, he dwelt within the sun disk, the Aten. He first rose into the sky in the form of Ra, and he himself was the Bennu bird, the phoenix, the spirit of Ra.
He kept the records of all things created and uncreated. Although the papyri from which we read this information date back to the 18th dynasty, every single idea they contain was already present in texts from the ancient kingdom era, thousands of years earlier. We do not know the exact style or nature of the worship directed at Tem, or what his rites were. However, the fact that he was depicted in a human form rather than as an animal, bird, or reptile suggests that his cult had a superior, more philosophical character than the ancient sacred animal cults prevalent in Egypt. The man-god Tem gradually assimilated the attributes of other great gods: old sky god Her-Ur, Khepera, the beetle god, the god of that mysterious moment between sunset and sunrise, and Her-Ahuti, the Horus of the two horizons. Khepera was the sun before dawn. The sun of the daytime was Hur, and the setting sun was Tem. Tem's priests were so wise that they incorporated the rites and ceremonies of the old gods worshipped by the common people into their own form of worship. Because for an Egyptian, the assimilation of one god by another was not strange. The assimilated god did not vanish, he was merely seen as a different phase, a different character of the greater god. Egyptians were extremely tolerant in such matters. But there was another sun god in Egypt. Monuments prove that a different form of the sun god called Ra was known and worshipped in Lower Egypt in the fairly early period of the dynastic age.
Ra is not the star figure of the simulation with the chaos giant like Tem. He may be a god brought to Egypt by polytheistic Asians who controlled the Heliopolis cult for a period. It was not difficult for the priests of the Heliopolis cult to identify their god Ra as a local sun god. He is the object of worship of the 4th dynasty pharaohs and is the only god who manages to include his name as Re among the kings. Ra's origins and early history are even more mysterious than Tem's. The meaning of his name has not yet been satisfactorily explained. He does not even appear to be of Egyptian origin. Perhaps he was an Asian sun god brought to Egypt in a very distant past. His character and attributes resemble those of the mighty Babylonian god Marduk, so much that Ra and Marduk may have been two faces of the same ancient ancestor, having taken different names. The center of the Ra cult was also Anu, or Heliopolis. This city must have been a cosmopolitan hub since very ancient times, a place where people of different nations, and mostly sun worshippers, converged. All caravans coming from Arabia and Syria, whether setting out or returning home, would stop here. People of many languages must have exchanged both ideas and goods in this city. Control of the sacred well that Arab writers called Ayin es Shems, Sunwell, was undoubtedly in the hands of the priests of Anu. The payments and offerings made by grateful travelers for watering their animals made these priests rich and powerful. The waters of that well were believed to come from the celestial waters, the waters of the primal mass, Nunu. Pianki, the king of Nubia, tells how when he went to Anu, he washed his face with the sacred water with which Ra was accustomed to wash his face. It is even recounted in one tradition that when the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, sought refuge in Egypt, the Virgin Mary drew water from this well. During the I-Vith dynasty, the priests of Anu gained immense political power. They managed to secure a superior position for their god Ra over all other gods in Lower Egypt. It is not known whether they personally selected the kings, but they certainly managed to have the name Ra incorporated
into the Nesu-Bat names of the builders of those massive pyramids at Giza, Khaf-Ra, Chephren, and Menkaure-Ra, Mycerinus.
They were not satisfied with this. They rejected the lineage of the great pyramid builders and placed a series of new kings, the 5th dynasty, on the throne, whom they declared to be the sons of the wife of one of their god Ra's priests. The first king of this dynasty adopted the title Sa-Ra, meaning son of Ra, as his personal name. This title, initiated by the 5th dynasty kings, became an inseparable part of Egyptian history. Every king who ruled Egypt thereafter, whether Nubian, Persian, Macedonian, like Alexander the Great, or Roman, like Caesar, never hesitated to call himself the son of Ra. The later kings of the 5th dynasty built special temples for Ra. These sun temples were about 100 meters long and 76 meters wide. At the western end, a truncated or stunted pyramid rose, and upon it stood a massive stone obelisk. On the eastern side of the pyramid was an altar made of alabaster. On the northern side of the altar were special channels and basins into which the blood of both animal and sometimes human sacrifices flowed and collected. The essential object of the Ra cult and its specific symbol was this obelisk reaching toward the sun. It is thought that the earliest sun worshippers believed their god resided in this specific pyramid-shaped stone. During certain seasons or for special rites, the spirit of the sun would be invited by the priests to settle upon this stone. The precise meaning of this sun symbol is unknown. Some believe it represents the axis between earth and sky. Some attribute a phallic meaning to it. Others connect it to a primal object that produced fire and heat. The only thing that is certain is that it symbolized Ra.
The cult of the standing stone or pillar was likely older than the Ra cult itself. Indeed, the oldest name for Heliopolis was Anu, meaning city of pillars. The spirit of the sun would occasionally visit the sun temple in the form of the Bennu bird, or phoenix, and alight upon the sacred Ben stone located in the house of the Bennu at Anu. This Bennu bird was regarded by the Egyptians as the spirit of Ra. During the 6th dynasty, the priests of Ra managed to elevate their god to the position of supreme lord of all gods. All the old sun gods in northern Egypt, such as Ra-Khepera, or Ra-Atem, and Ra-Hera-Kiti, were now accepted as mere forms, different faces of Ra. He was the king of the sky, the judge of gods and men. The priests also tried to make him the king of the underworld, Tuat, and the lord of Osiris. However, they failed in this last point. Osiris always maintained his position as the god and judge of the dead. Although Ra's priests gave Ra great powers over the underworld in the pyramid texts, within a century, Osiris had regained absolute sovereignty over Ament, the land of the dead. From all this, we understand that long before the end of the 6th dynasty, the priests of the various sun gods in Lower Egypt had already attributed to their gods all the fundamental powers and attributes that the heretic king Akhenaten would later claim for his own god, Aten.
Although the priests of the sun gods, Tem, Ra, and Horus, in Egypt had already proclaimed their gods to be one and eternal by the time the 6th dynasty ended, the question remains: if all these ideas already existed, how did the Aten cult turn into a revolution? To find the answer, we must look at those who ruled Egypt before the heretic king Akhenaten, especially his father. Everything begins during the famous 18th dynasty of Egypt, at the peak of the Golden Age, when the sun gods were at their most powerful. The sun disk, or Aten, had always been there. It was the place where the gods dwelt. The ancient texts spoke of Tem in his disk, or Ra, who dwells in his disk. The disk was not the god himself, but his house, his vehicle. Then Thutmose IV ascended the throne. This pharaoh largely owed his throne to the priests of Ra in Heliopolis. Thus, his heart was closer to the ancient sun gods of the north than to Amen, the rising god of Thebes. He did not include Amen's name in all his titles, but knowing Amen's power, he maintained good relations with them, presenting offerings to their temples. He was the man who initiated the silence before the storm. Thutmose IV was succeeded by his son, one of the most magnificent and wealthiest pharaohs Egypt had ever seen, Amenhotep III. The mighty priests of Thebes immediately embraced this new king. They fabricated a colossal myth to bolster his legitimacy. They claimed this king is no ordinary mortal. Our god Amen himself took the form of King Thutmose IV and visited Queen Mutemua. Amenhotep III is the true son of Amen, with the god's blood flowing in his veins.
Yet there was a peculiarity in Amenhotep III's character. His mother, Mutemua, was a Mitanni princess. Foreign blood flowed in his veins,
and foreign gods whispered in his mind. The foreign education he received may have drawn him closer to the religions of his mother's homeland than to the strict rules of Amen. This pharaoh was unlike other Egyptian kings. He was not merely a servant of the gods. Those who look at the reliefs in the Sulb temple in Sudan encounter a surprising scene. King Amenhotep III is depicted presenting offerings to the god Amen, to whom he dedicated the temple, and right next to him he is also presenting offerings to his own deified image. He was a king who worshipped himself. All the gods of Egypt were one to him, provided that he, as the greatest god, was also honored. And then he took the most important step of his life, a move that would change Egypt's entire destiny. He married. This was no political marriage for the alliance of kingdoms. The woman he chose was a commoner named T, or Tei, who did not possess a high rank or noble title. When the tombs of T's parents, Iuau and Thuau, were discovered in 1905, this truth became starkly apparent. They were humble people, native Egyptians. This was a love marriage, a rare occurrence in the history of the pharaohs. Despite her humble origins, however, Queen T would become one of the most remarkable and powerful women the Egyptian court had ever seen. Her influence over her husband, Amenhotep III, was immense. She practically ruled the pharaoh.
The proof of this is carved into the cold stones of the monuments. T's name was inscribed directly next to her husband's in official texts. This proved that she was not just a royal consort, but a co-ruler who governed Egypt alongside her husband. She participated in public duties and religious ceremonies with a power unknown to any queen before her. The king's love and respect for her were so great that he built a temple in Sudan at Sedenga dedicated to Queen T herself. T was worshipped as a goddess while she was still alive. Amenhotep III was so proud to marry this commoner that he had colossal steatite scarabs made to proclaim it to the world. He had his own name, Queen T's name, and even the names of her non-noble mother, Thuau, and father Iau carved onto these amulets. And at the bottom, he added this note: T is the wife of the victorious king who owns the lands extending from Napata in the south to the Euphrates in the north. This was the most magnificent way of saying to the world, "This is the woman I love, and she is your queen." We do not know exactly what Queen T's personal religious views were, but there is a strong clue that she struck the first spark of the great storm. To please his beloved wife, the king had a colossal artificial lake built on his estate in western Thebes. This lake was about 2 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. In the 11th year of his reign, on the 16th day of the Akhet season, October, His Majesty commissioned a special barge, a royal boat, to sail across this lake. Historians gasped when they read the name of this boat. The boat was dedicated neither to Amun nor to Ra. The boat's name was Aten Tehen, the meaning Aten shines.
The most powerful pharaoh of Egypt had named the magnificent boat he built for his beloved queen after Aten, which until then had only been the disk of the sun, regarded as the dwelling of a god. The famous Egyptologist Maspero underscored this event. The king's water procession in honor of Queen T likely marked the beginning of the Aten cult in Thebes. The seed cast from that boat would, years later, turn into a wildfire that consumed all of Egypt. Because this magnificent king and this powerful queen had children, 4 daughters and 1 son. Their son's name was Amenhotep IV, the heretic king whom history would know as Akhenaten. Even though Queen T seemed to be the sole owner of the pharaoh's heart, ruling a great empire required more than just a pharaoh's heart. It required political ties. Amenhotep III reinforced his palace with other wives who came from distant lands. The priceless clay tablet letters found at Tal al-Amarna whisper that he married both the sister and the daughter of Tushratta, the king of Mitanni. In the 10th year of his reign, the Mitanni princess Gilukipa arrived in Egypt as a bride with a massive retinue of 317 people. This was more like a union of 2 empires than a marriage. He later married Tushratta's daughter Tatumhipa, and priceless gifts flowed into Egypt with this marriage. And the seeds of that great revolution were sown not only on Queen T's boat, Aten Shines, but also in these foreign courts.
These foreign princesses and the large entourages that accompanied them to Egypt had a tremendous influence at the Theban court, and they were devoted not to Amen, the mighty god of Thebes, but to the gods of their homelands, beliefs that were quite unlike Egypt's. Queen T's son, the young prince 4th Amenhotep, that is, the future Akhenaten, grew up amidst these foreign aunts, different cultures and whispers. Perhaps the deep hatred he felt for Amen and his arrogant, all-controlling priests blossomed in those palace corridors, where he heard the stories of the Aryan gods Mithras, Indra, and Varuna, who bore little resemblance to the gods of Egypt. However, Amenhotep III was not just a king who sat in his palace, indulged in philosophical reveries, and waged different religions, at least not in his youth. He was also a hunter, with a warrior's spirit flowing in his veins. And he wanted these accomplishments recorded, but not on ordinary papyri. Just as he proclaimed his love for Queen T, he also had his hunting adventures carved onto colossal steatite scarabs. No other king in Egypt had used this sacred khepera symbol in this way to advertise his personal achievements and private affairs. One of these hunting scarabs recounts a breathtaking story from the 2nd year of his reign. The king received news that
that a herd of wild cattle had been spotted in Lower Egypt. Amenhotep immediately set out by boat and traveled all night. He arrived at the location at first light. He gathered all the people. They formed a huge fence with stakes and ropes. And then, in true African fashion, with shouts and cries, they drove 170 terrified wild cattle into the enclosure. The king drove his war chariot among them and killed 56 alone. A few days later, he killed 20 more. Another group of hunting scarabs proudly declares that from the 1st to the 10th year of his reign, he personally hunted and killed exactly 102 wild lions. Thus, the reign of Amenhotep III was a unique, solitary golden age in Egyptian history. When he ascended the throne, he found himself the absolute ruler of Egyptian Sudan, which stretched from Syria to Phoenicia and from Egypt south to Napata.
He did not have to fight. His great ancestor, the mighty conqueror Thutmose III, had already conquered the world as the Egyptians knew it for him. Amenhotep had hardly needed to draw his sword to preserve this vast empire. Of course, he suppressed a minor revolt in Nubia in the 5th year of his reign. But this was merely a small border skirmish that resulted in 740 prisoners and the death of 312 rebels. Other than this, the empire was at peace. The princes and nobles in Sudan worshipped him not only as their lord, but also as their god. Countless amounts of gold, precious stones, and slaves flowed into Thebes every year. The great independent kings of Phoenicia, Syria, Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni practically vied with each other for his friendship and alliance. They paid their tribute without hesitation. During his visits to Western Asia, Amenhotep enjoyed hunting lions in the deserts south of Sinjar and in the thickets along the Khabur River. This passion for hunting earned him many friends among the sheiks of Mesopotamia. Caravans could travel comfortably to and from Egypt because in those days, traders from the Mediterranean islands and coasts flocked to Egypt, where gold was as plentiful as dust. Amenhotep also knew how to spend this immense wealth well. He dedicated most of the wealth he inherited and the annual revenue from the tribute-paying peoples to enlarging and beautifying the temples of Thebes. He had grand ideas, loved to create magnificent works, and spared neither effort nor expense in creating them. On the east bank, he made massive additions to the temple of Karnak. He completed the temple of Mut. He connected the temples of Karnak and Luxor with an avenue of cryosphinxes, ram-headed sphinxes, each holding his figure between its paws. And at Luxor, he built the famous colonnade, which remains one of the most beautiful examples of its kind in Egypt today.
On the west bank, he built a magnificent mortuary temple for his own immortality and erected 2 colossal statues at its entrance known today as the Colossi of Memnon. On Elephantine Island, he built a temple in honor of Khnum, the great god of the first cataract. He also rebuilt and greatly augmented the Sulb Temple in Sudan. Under his patronage, art and craftsmanship reached an unprecedented peak in Egypt. Stonemasons, wood carvers, and faience workers produced extraordinary works. The king spent his wealth nobly. In many ways, his character resembled that of a wealthy, pleasure-seeking, comfortable, and benevolent Mesopotamian sheik, perhaps due to the Mitanni blood in his veins, more than an Egyptian pharaoh. Historian Dr. Hall aptly named him Amenhotep the Magnificent. After this golden reign of about 36 years, he died. And this is the most interesting and critical point of the story. His love for Queen T, the boat named Aten Shines, the whispers of his foreign wives. Whatever his personal views on Aten, Amenhotep III was buried with all the pomp and ceremony befitting an Orthodox pharaoh, strictly adhering to Egypt's ancient traditions, in his tomb in the West Valley at Thebes. Although his tomb was later plundered by robbers, the government of the time managed to rescue his mummy and hide it in the tomb of Amenhotep II, where it was found by Loret thousands of years later in 1899. Amenhotep the Magnificent had departed the world according to tradition, but he had left behind a son who would shatter that tradition and declare war on all the gods of Egypt. Excellent. So, we transition from the golden age of Egypt to the darkest and most disruptive revolution in its history, the arrival of the heretic king.
When Amenhotep the Magnificent departed to the afterlife in all his glory, the son of Queen T ascended the throne of Egypt. His name was Amenhotep IV. He would rule for about 17 years and likely die before reaching the age of 30. The story of this young king begins like Tutankhamun's with a mystery. A mummy of a young man found in Queen T's tomb, or one believed to be hers, and generally attributed to Amenhotep IV, has offered chilling clues to modern scientists. Dr. Elliot Smith, upon examining the skeleton, determined it belonged to a man aged 25 or 26, and he added a far more striking detail. The skull clearly exhibits the characteristic distortion of hydrocephalus, or water on the brain. If this mummy truly belongs to the heretic king, it indicates that he struggled with a serious physical and perhaps mental affliction throughout his life. In this case, he must have been a child of only 9 or 10 years old when he ascended the throne upon his father's death. Even if his father, Amenhotep the Magnificent, had been alive, he was not the kind of man to teach his son the traditions of the warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III, who built Egypt. Amenhotep III's long and peaceful reign had made Egypt forget that its comfortable and luxurious life had been bought with the bloody victories of its ancestors. There was no great commander in the palace to teach the young prince the arts of war. Instead, he had other teachers. His powerful mother, Queen T, who continued to rule Egypt from behind the scenes even after his father's death. His incredibly beautiful wife, Nefertiti,
whom he married, perhaps his sister, daughter of his father by a Mesopotamian woman, and, above all, a man named Ai, the husband of his nurse. This Ai was no ordinary man. He was a priest of Aten.
The young prince Amenhotep IV grew up within this triangle. In his childhood, sitting at Ai's feet, he learned the fundamentals of the Aten cult, the philosophy of the sun disk. The teachings of this new religion merged in his mind with the stories of the foreign gods told by his Mitanni aunts. And this fusion bore a deadly fruit. He developed a hatred not only for the supreme god Amen of Thebes, but for all the ancient gods and goddesses of Egypt, except for the sun gods of Heliopolis. Perhaps these gods reminded him of the Aryan deities like Varuna, worshipped by his grandmother's people, gods to whom human sacrifices were offered and with whom he sympathized. But there was a deeper reason. He saw how the priests of Amen had usurped royal power, becoming the true force in Egypt through their wealth and cunning. Amen's revenues were astronomical, and his priest's power encompassed the entire empire, from Napata in the south to Syria in the north. During the first 5 or 6 years of his reign, Amenhotep IV, likely still under the skillful guidance of his mother, Queen T, made little change in the country's administration. But those quiet years were the preparation before the storm. He was a precocious and intelligent child. He possessed a quick mind, a resolute will, and a fearless nature. He was bound by a prophet's faith to the righteousness and honesty of his intentions and actions. However, despite all these capabilities, he lacked any practical knowledge of people. He never grasped the true nature of his duties to his people as a king. He failed to see that the empire, won for him by warriors, could only be held by a warrior's hand. Instead of associating with men of action, he sat at the feet of the priest Ai and filled his mind with religious speculations. Thus, with the help of his admiring mother and relatives, he gradually became the most courageous, most reckless fanatic in Egyptian history.
Modern writers bestowed titles upon him like the Great Idealist, the Great Reformer, the World's First Revolutionary, and History's First Individual. However, in light of Dr. Elliot Smith's diagnosis of hydrocephalus and the known historical facts, Dr. Hall was entirely right to wonder, was the king truly half mad? Because only a half-mad man, or at least one suffering from religious fervor, would dare to overthrow the mighty god Amen and his millennia-old cult, around which the entire social life and economy of his country revolved. His spiritual pride and unshakable self-sufficiency rendered him insensitive to everything outside his own feelings and emotions. When Amenhotep IV decided that Amen and all the other gods of Egypt must be abolished, he did not delay for a moment. After years of contemplation, he had reached a conclusion. Only the sun gods of the two horizons, Tem, Ra, and Horus, were worthy of veneration, and the form of worship he chose was that ancient symbol which had been the dwelling, home of Tem and Ra, Aten, the sun disk. But in his mind, this disk was no longer merely a dwelling. It was the God himself. It was the deity that gave life directly to everything on earth through the heat and light radiating from its own body. Amenhotep IV attributed all the qualities of the old gods, Tem, Ra, Horus, Ptah, and even Amen, to Aten, and then he issued his revolutionary declaration. Aten was the one and the solitary. In fact, this idea of unity was not new to Egypt. The priests of every great god in Egypt had proclaimed their own god to be one since ancient times.
But Amenhotep's distinction was this: his god, Aten, was the one who permitted no others to exist. He was initiating Egypt's first experiment in monotheism. He sealed his views on the nature of his god within 2 royal cartouches with the following official title: the living Horus of the 2 horizons, who is exalted in the eastern horizon in his name of Shu, who is in the disk. This title is the key to his theology. The word Shu means heat or heat and light. Amenhotep was worshiping the heat, that physical energy within the sun. He deified the heat and light found in the disk. The old Heliopolitan tradition viewed Tem or Ra as the creator of the disk, Aten. Amenhotep IV rejected this view. He argued that the disk was self-created and self-sufficient, and he changed the symbol of his god. The old symbol was a disk encircled by a serpent. Amenhotep abolished the serpent, the symbol of the old gods. In its place, he put a series of rays descending from the disk, each terminating in a hand, with those hands bestowing life, the Ankh symbol, onto the earth. This symbol, this philosophical and abstract cult, never appealed to the spirit of the Egyptian people. They preferred to believe in gods with stories, gods who traveled in boats across the sky. His father, Amenhotep III, was tolerant. To him, all gods were one. But for his son, the situation was different. The warmth of Aten gave him life, and with that life, inside him, Aten was also inside him. Aten's life was his life. Therefore, he was Aten. He was not an ordinary god, but God's very incarnation on earth. With this belief, he no longer needed to perform the sacred duty that Egyptian kings had carried out for thousands of years, going to the temple of Ammon every day to receive the wisdom and the life fluid necessary to rule the country. He no longer needed it. He would not even allow the high priest of Ammon
to act as his proxy.
The decision was final. Amen and all other gods were to be abolished. All the dogmas of their priesthoods were to be destroyed, and Aten was to be proclaimed the one, self-created, self-existent God, ruled by his son and vicar, i.e., himself. Without considering the consequences for a moment, he immediately acted. In Thebes, the sacred city, he began building the Gemetan temple at Per Aten. Inside the temple, imitating the Heliopolitan priests, he placed the sacred Benben stone, which meant sunstone, and the location he chose for the temple. This was less an act of construction and more an act of insult. He built the temple precisely between the colossal temple of Amen at Karnak and the glorious temple of Amen at Luxor. The impact of this action on the priests of Amen and the people of Thebes is not hard to guess. The fall of Amen meant the collapse of the livelihood of thousands of people. But the king was Amenhotep. Blood, now the blood of the sun god, flowed in his veins. And the pharaoh was the absolute owner of everything in Egypt. The priests and the people could not resist his will. They had to watch as Amen's enormous revenues were confiscated and his worship was banned. Not content with this, he ordered the name of Amen to be chiseled out of monuments. This decree went so far as to erase even his father's name, Amenhotep the Magnificent, from cartouches. Not just the name Amen, but even the word gods, plural, was obliterated. There were no more gods. The only god to be worshipped was Aten. The result of this decree was the harbinger of a civil war. Thebes was filled with the murmurs of Amen's angry followers. When the new Aten temple was completed and worship began, these murmurs turned into threats and curses. Conflicts between the Amenists and the Atenists filled the city. We will never know exactly what happened. Perhaps a revolt broke out, or maybe an assassination attempt on the king.
But the result was certain. Amenhotep IV found it impossible to reside in Thebes any longer. Faced with the rising hatred and potential danger from the priests of Amen in Thebes, Amenhotep IV made a decision. He would abandon that ancient city, the heart of Egypt's thousands of years of history. In the 6th year of his reign, the king declared a previously untouched, virgin area of Egypt to be a sacred land belonging to Aten. This was a region on the eastern bank of the Nile, about 250 miles or approximately 400 kilometers north of Thebes, surrounded by desert sands and rocky hills in the vicinity of present-day Tal al-Amarna. The king named this region after his god, Aten, Akhet Aten, meaning the horizon of Aten. This choice was not random. He had specifically sworn an oath to build a city for his god. That oath can still be read on the famous boundary stelae carved into the rocks marking the city's limits. In the very center of this region, the king began building a massive and glorious capital with his own hands. The city sprang forth from the earth as if by a miracle. Thousands of workers, masters, and artists were brought from all over Egypt and the conquered lands of Nubia for the construction of Akhet Aten. This rapidly rising city was a perfect reflection of the king's architectural vision. The great temple of Aten. It stood at the city's heart. In contrast to the dark, introspective, and dim atmosphere of the Amen temples, this temple was built entirely in the open air. The most important requirement for the worship of Aten was the direct light of the sun disk itself. This temple had no roofs, sacred chambers, or enclosed corridors. A high, bright altar ascended towards the sky, allowing the sun god to reach the worshippers directly. The royal palace was where the king and queen themselves lived. It was built on a slope leading towards the Nile, near the temple.
The queen's smaller temple, a more intimate place of worship, reserved for Queen Nefertiti and their daughters. As the city neared completion, Amenhotep IV took the last and greatest step. He changed his own name, which was used in all monuments and official documents, because it contained the cursed word Amen. He would henceforth be known by the name Akhenaten. This new name clearly proclaimed who he was and what he represented. The one who was beneficial to Aten, or the spirit of Aten. Similarly, the name of his wife, the world's most beautiful woman, Nefertiti, also had an Aten suffix added, although the change was less radical as her name already held an Aten connotation. Akhenaten viewed Akhet Aten not merely as a political capital, but as the center of the Aten religion. It was the only place on earth where Aten's light was transmitted in its purest form. The new doctrine of Aten and the art revolution. Everything changed in the new city. Akhenaten revolutionized not only religion, but also art. The old, rigid, and rule-bound Egyptian art came to an end. In its place, artists adopted a natural, flowing style that reflected daily life. Realism. Kings and queens were now depicted not as idealized divine figures, but in real human form, with their physical imperfections. Artists fearlessly portrayed Nefertiti's slender neck, Akhenaten's elongated skull, sagging abdomen, and thin legs. If his mummy is correct, these were his physical flaws.
However, this revolution meant the collapse of the Egyptian empire externally. While Akhenaten dedicated all his energy to Aten's temples and philosophical thoughts, he ignored the desperate pleas, Amarna letters, for help
from the loyal vassals in Syria and Palestine. Lost in his own idealism, the king allowed Egypt to lose its external power. Akhenaten's short and turbulent reign ended without leaving a male heir. After a brief period of chaos, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, most likely Akhenaten's son or stepson, ascended the throne. Tutankhamun's ascension was more than just a change of power. It was a spiritual turning point for Egypt. The young king immediately banned the Aten cult, changed his name to Tutankhamun, and reinstated the ancient Egyptian gods, Amen, Ptah, Osiris, and others. This act symbolized the return to Egypt's millennia-old traditions and the restoration of central authority. The famous obelisk in Cairo recounts in bitter terms how the country had become a ruin and chaos during Akhenaten's time, with temples abandoned and gods turning their backs. Tutankhamun reversed this destruction by restoring the temples with gold and spoils from Nubia and making generous endowments. Tutankhamun's sudden and mysterious death brought Egypt to the brink of a brief crisis. The desperate letter from his wife, Queen Ankhesenamun, to the Hittite emperor, asking him to send a prince to marry her, Bogoski tablets, shows the depth of the political crisis of that era. General Horemheb, who succeeded Tutankhamun, completed the counter-revolution. He razed Akhenaten's city, Akhet-Aten, destroyed its monuments, and attempted to erase Aten's name from Egyptian history. These actions also explain why Tutankhamun's tomb was left unplundered in the Valley of the Kings. The heretic king's successor's tomb was simply overlooked during Horemheb's cleansing. Although the heretic king's revolution failed, it remains Egypt's greatest mystery. Tutankhamun's short reign, however, went down in history as a symbol of the ultimate triumph of tradition, commitment to its roots, and the recovery of Egypt's political and religious strength.
Therefore, when he died and the new king, Tutankhamun, arrived, the Egyptian people did not hesitate. They immediately returned to their old beliefs, their old gods, and the reassuring old order. Akhenaten was a devout, arrogant, and stubborn fanatic, born too early for his own country. His 17-year reign inflicted untold suffering on Egypt, but also left a legacy for the modern world, the first known experiment in monotheism and the beauty of naturalistic art. To summarize the story of Tutankhamun and the Aten Revolution, during the glorious 18th dynasty of Egypt, at the peak of the Golden Age, a storm of faith erupted along the banks of the Nile. At the center of this storm lay the story of two young pharaohs, Akhenaten, the heretic king, and his successor, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amen.
The story begins in the reign of Amenhotep III, the magnificent king. He brought unprecedented wealth and peace to Egypt, but his heart belonged to his common-born wife, Queen Ti. The influence of Ti and the whispers of foreign princesses in the palace sowed seeds of doubt against the mighty god Amen of Thebes. The king made his first defiance against the Amen priests by commissioning a boat named Aten, the sun disk. These seeds blossomed in the mind of Amenhotep IV, Ti's son. This young prince, intelligent and likely affected by a physical ailment, hated the power of the Amen priests who ruled Egypt. Under the influence of Ai, his nurse's husband, and an Aten priest, he waged war against all of Egypt's millennia-old polytheistic beliefs. He declared that Aten, the sun disk, was the only universal God who directly created life on earth. Driven by religious fanaticism, Amenhotep IV first changed his name to Akhenaten, the one who is beneficial to Aten. Then he cursed and abandoned Thebes, Egypt's traditional capital. In the virgin lands in the middle of the Nile, he founded Akhet-Aten, meaning the horizon of Aten. In this city, a new lifestyle and art began. The king and queen Nefertiti were lovingly portrayed with their children beneath the rays of Aten. Art became realistic and naturalistic.
A word on Egyptian monotheism. Finally, before concluding this epic tale, we should recall why Akhenaten is called the world's first monotheist. In fact, even in the earliest Egyptian texts, there is evidence that Egyptian priests and scholars believed in an unnamed, incomprehensible, and eternal supreme being whom they called Neter. This god was the very power whose plans were unknowable, who loved obedience, provided daily bread, and was the source of all existence. A distinction always existed in the minds of the Egyptians between that supreme god, Pa-Neter, and the god of the city, Neter. The supreme god was the unknown, the incomprehensible one. He had delegated the governance of creation to the kind gods and the malevolent demons. Akhenaten's monotheism, however, was different. It was an abstract philosophy. Akhenaten reduced the universal power governed by that unknown abstract Neter into a concrete form, the sun disk Aten, and then he declared Aten to be the sole deity who rejected the existence of all other gods. His monotheism was more of a political innovation than a religious one. His goal was to break the power of the Amen priesthood and make Aten the sole universal and absolute ruler of Egypt, Sudan, and Asia. But he failed because he could not touch the hearts of his people. The Egyptians did not understand philosophical abstractions. For thousands of years, they had chosen to cling to physical forms, stories, and rituals. believing in gods like Osiris, Isis, and Anubis, who guided them in the afterlife. Akhenaten gave his people neither a god who promised immortality nor a religion that offered funeral rites. The religion he offered was merely the philosophy of living in the moment, dancing and singing in the warmth of Aten, and based on the happiness of the king and the queen themselves.
After Tutankhamun, an elderly and shrewd figure emerged. I, the husband of Akhenaten's nurse and that first Aten priest. I took the title Lord of the Horse and ascended Tutankhamun's throne. After a short reign, he was succeeded by General Horemheb, an experienced officer who had struggled to maintain authority in the north of the empire during Akhenaten's time. Horemheb completed the counter-revolution initiated by Tutankhamun, the restoration of the old order, and sanctioned it. This meant the irreversible decline and collapse of the Aten cult. Akhenaten's ghost could no longer rule Egypt. The end of Akhet-Aten. The horizon of Aten, Akhet-Aten, lost all its importance and fell into decay. Artisans and artists who could not find work migrated to the center of Egypt, to Thebes and other cities, where they could work in the service of Amen. Many Atenists abandoned their god and shifted their worship to Amen, who promised them livelihood and order. The temples and houses of the officials must have been plundered by mobs, fueled by the anger of the old god's followers. The abandoned city quickly fell into ruin and was never rebuilt. Historians estimate that the lifespan of this great revolutionary capital was no more than 50 years. The city is marked today by the ruins and rock-cut tombs widely known as Tal al-Amarna, near the Arab villages of Hag Kandil and Al-Tal. With the discovery of the famous Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the tomb itself showing the wealth of the old order after Akhenaten's destruction, the world became intensely interested in Akhenaten's revolution and the chaos that followed. As excavations continue, the true history of that revolutionary city and the heretic king slowly continues to emerge from beneath the sands of Egypt.
Excellent. Now we will witness the final act of this revolution, the fall of the heretic king and the restoration of the old order by a young pharaoh, the end of the revolution and the chaos. In the final years of his reign, Akhenaten was on the brink of both physical and mental collapse. He struggled with domestic and foreign troubles. His greatest fear had come true. He had had 7 daughters by his queen Nefertiti and his other wives. Some sources say he also married Nefertiti's daughter, Meritaten, but he had no son to continue his line. He knew he could not make the Aten cult the national religion of Egypt and that the entire population hated him. All these factors gradually consumed his proud and passionate spirit, and subsequently his health. Sensing his end was near, he did what he felt he had to. He appointed an official heir. This heir was Saqqara Chesar Kheperi, who married his eldest daughter, Meritaten. Akhenaten appointed him as co-regent. This was the last desperate sign that he wanted the Aten cult to continue. But the wheels of fate had already begun to turn. Akhenaten died about 17 years after ascending the throne, likely before reaching the age of 30. Even in his burial, he defied tradition. He was interred not with his ancestors in the Valley of the Kings, but in a tomb carved into the rocks on the eastern bank of the Nile, which he had commissioned himself. Although his tomb was later found and plundered by robbers, some fragments of his cartouches remained as a memorial. After the king's death, his fervent disciple and son-in-law, the co-regent Saqqara, ascended the throne. However, his reign was probably very short and insignificant. There is no definite information about his actions, how he was deposed, or whether he died. He too suddenly vanished from the historical stage. It was precisely at this moment of chaos that the young king who would determine Egypt's future appeared, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun filled the void left by Akhenaten. He was not just a king, but the living embodiment of Egypt's famous, complex gods. As mentioned earlier, he immediately changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamen and banned Aten.
Family life. No royal family had ever shown such closeness and shared intimacy with the public as Akhenaten and Nefertiti. In reliefs and statues, the queen and king were shown embracing, even kissing and holding their children. All these scenes were illuminated by the rays of the sun disk descending from above, terminating in hands that bestowed life. This art revolution was a reflection of Akhenaten's philosophy of living in truth. All the traditional symbolism, hierarchy, and artificiality of ancient Egypt were instantly discarded. Akhenaten's poetic faith. The climax of Akhenaten's faith is the great hymn to the Aten, carved into the tombs in his new city. This hymn is not just a prayer, but one of the oldest and deepest poems of monotheism. In this hymn, Akhenaten exalts Aten thus: "When you rise in the horizon, O living Aten, you are the Lord of Egypt and all foreign lands. Every eye looks to you. You are the one who established yourself. There is no other on earth but you. You created them and then defined their places. And everyone, the people, went their own way. You are the one God far away, but your rays, hands, are upon the earth." The most crucial part of this hymn is its declaration that Aten is the god not only of Egypt, but of the entire world, and that he created even Egypt's neighbors. This was the biggest philosophical blow struck against the Amen cult, which had championed the local supremacy of Egyptian gods. However,
Akhenaten's piety had a limit. He was the sole intermediary standing between the god and the people. The hymn states, "No one knows you except your son Akhenaten. You have enlightened him with your name and power."
Thus, one could not truly worship Aten without understanding Akhenaten. Aten spoke only to him. The only thing the people had to do was worship the king and his queen. This was Egypt's monotheism. However, in place of Amen's theocracy, it had turned into an absolute theocracy. The fiasco, collapse of foreign policy. While Akhenaten was experiencing this revolution internally, the external world was collapsing around him. As he dedicated all his energy to Aten, the empire that his father, Amenhotep the Magnificent, had painstakingly built was disintegrating. The famous Amarna letters found in Akhenaten prove how quickly the empire unraveled. The desperate pleas from the loyal principalities in Syria and Palestine were not even reaching the king's ear. Hebrew raiders and the Amuru chiefs, allies of the Hittites, were invading Egypt's vassal states one after another. The king's loyal governors begged, "Send me a unit of archers, or the city will fall." But Akhenaten turned a deaf ear to these calls. He was not a warrior king, but a priest, philosopher king. He believed that all these external problems were the wrath of the old gods, but that they would all vanish if he served Aten faithfully. The result was a total fiasco. Egypt lost control of those vast territories extending all the way to the Euphrates River. By the end of Akhenaten's reign, Egypt had retreated to its natural borders, a giant bleeding internally. Akhenaten lived happily in Akhenaten, immersed in his idealism, until that city turned from a paradise into a prison.